but with the experience of 42 years, and that I was hungry every day, and I gave everybody my best shot, and I always wanted to be a part of a team, and obviously I wanted to lead that team. And people ask me all the time about championships, Final Fours, March Madness, and the great players I was fortunate enough to coach. But one question has always been harder for me than the others. What was the greatest college basketball team I ever saw? You know, most people answer that by looking at records. How many games did they win? How many future NBA players did they have? Did they win the national championship? I understand that. Those things matter. But after spending most of my life in college basketball, I learned to see greatness a little differently. For me, a great team was a team that made you change the way you prepared. A team that forced you to look at the game differently. Sometimes it was their talent, sometimes it was their discipline. Sometimes it was the way five guys seemed to think and move as one. And sometimes, quite frankly, it was a team that beat you badly enough that you never forgot what it felt like. So this isn't a ranking. I'm not saying these were the five greatest teams in the history of the game. I'm talking about five teams that stayed with me. I've got to start with UNLV. I can still remember that championship game in 1990 because as a coach, there are certain nights that stay with you, whether you want them to or not. We came into Denver believing we had a chance to win a national championship. We had Christian Laettner, Bobby Hurley, Allah Abdelnaby, Brian Davis. We were young, but we believed in what we were doing. Then we ran into UNLV, and they didn't just beat us. They took away almost everything we wanted to do. Larry Johnson was incredibly powerful. Stacey Augmon could guard just about anybody. Greg Anthony controlled the game. Anderson Hunt seemed to punish every mistake we made. But what I remember most was their defense. They pushed us away from where we wanted to operate. They pressured the ball, they closed passing lanes, and every turnover seemed to become another opportunity for them to run. We lost that game 103-73, 30 points in a national championship game. That stays with you. You know, after the game, I wasn't sitting there thinking that my team simply had a bad night. There is a difference between playing poorly and having another team make it almost impossible for you to play well. UNLV did that to us. They wore us down physically, but they also wore us down mentally. Every time you thought you had found a little space, somebody was there. As a coach, that gets your attention. What made them special wasn't just that they had great individual players. They had an identity. Jerry Tarkanian had those guys playing with tremendous confidence, and they trusted the way they played. They wanted pressure. They wanted speed. They wanted the game to become uncomfortable for you. And the remarkable thing is, they came back the next season even better. When we met them again in the Final Four in 1991, they hadn't lost a game all season. They had won 45 straight going back to the previous year. We eventually beat them 79-77, but even after that game, I knew one victory didn't suddenly erase what they were. I wasn't convinced we would beat them again if we played the next night. That's the respect I had for that team. People sometimes think coaches only remember the teams they beat. That's not true. Some of the teams that teach you the most are the ones that expose you. UNLV did that to me. They forced me to look at our program and understand how much stronger, tougher, and more prepared we needed to become. And years later, when people ask me about the greatest teams I ever saw, I still think about that group. Because before we ever became champions, they showed us what championship level basketball really looked like. Then there was North Carolina in 1982. That team stayed with me for a different reason. I was still early in my time at Duke, still trying to build something, still trying to understand exactly what our program could become. And right there in our own conference was North Carolina. Dean Smith already had a culture. He had a system. He had players who understood what was expected of them. That 1982 team had James Worthy, Sam Perkins, and a freshman named Michael Jordan. Now, people look back and see Jordan first. I understand that. But at that time, James Worthy was the more established player, and Sam Perkins gave them so much stability. What impressed me was how naturally everything fit together. Nobody seemed to be fighting for attention. Nobody was trying to prove he was bigger than the team. That matters more than people think. When you coach talented players, the challenge is not always teaching them how to play. Sometimes the challenge is getting them to understand when not to force themselves into the game. North Carolina had that balance. They could play with patience, they could defend, they could execute, and when the game became tight, they didn't suddenly become something different. They stayed who they were. That was Dean. I had enormous respect for the way he built teams. You always knew there was structure behind what North Carolina was doing. There was discipline, there was trust, and there was an expectation that the name on the front of the jersey meant more than the name on the back. That season ended with them beating Georgetown 63-62 for the national championship. Jordan hit the shot everybody remembers, but when I think about that team, I don't reduce them to one shot. I think about the way the pieces fit. Worthy could dominate without needing the ball every possession. Perkins gave them consistency. Jordan, even as a freshman, had the confidence to step into a huge moment. And Dean had all of them playing inside the same idea. As a young coach, that taught me something. You can recruit talent, you can draw up plays, you can work people as hard as you want, but if great players don't believe in one another, eventually the game exposes it. North Carolina didn't have that problem. And watching them helped me understand that the strongest teams are not always the loudest teams. Sometimes the strongest team is the one where everybody already knows who they are. I've got to mention Georgetown in 1984. That was a completely different kind of team. When you watched Georgetown, you felt their identity right away. John Thompson had built something tough, disciplined, and very clear. They knew exactly what they wanted the game to feel like. And Patrick Ewing was right in the middle of all of it. Ewing changed the floor. That's the simplest way I can say it. You could run your offense correctly and still come away with nothing because he was waiting around the rim. He blocked shots, of course, but it was more than that. Players started thinking about him before they ever got into the lane. That changes decisions. It changes timing. It changes confidence. And when one player can do that, the entire defense becomes stronger. But Georgetown wasn't just Patrick Ewing. That's what I respected. They were physical, they were connected, they played with an edge, they made you earn everything. You couldn't expect to get comfortable against them because they didn't allow comfort. And John's personality was all over that team. He expected toughness, he expected discipline, he expected his players to carry themselves a certain way. You could see that in how they defended, how they competed, and how they responded when games became difficult. They finished that season by beating Houston 84-75 in the national championship game. That Houston team had tremendous talent, but Georgetown never looked overwhelmed by the moment. They stayed inside themselves, they defended, they rebounded, they trusted what had gotten them there. As a coach, I admired that. You know, there are teams with great talent that can beat you because one or two players have a special night. Georgetown was different. They could beat you because their whole personality wore you down. And that's something I thought about a lot as I continued building Duke. What do you want people to feel when they play your team? What do you want your players to believe about themselves before the ball is even thrown up? John Thompson had answers to those questions. That 1984 Georgetown team had an identity that was impossible to miss. Years later, when I thought about leadership and culture, I understood more clearly what I had been watching. A great team doesn't just have a style. It has a personality, and Georgetown had one of the strongest personalities I ever saw in college basketball. Teep. This one may surprise some people, but I always remember that Kentucky team in 1996. Rick Pitino had built a team that could come at you in waves. That was the first thing that stood out to me. You could prepare for Tony Delk, you could prepare for Antoine Walker, you could prepare for Ron Mercer or Walter McCarty, but then you looked at the rest of that roster and realized the problem wasn't one player. The problem was that Kentucky could keep bringing in another good player without losing what made them dangerous. They pressured you, they sped you up, they made you feel like every possession had to happen a little faster than you wanted. And as a coach, that can become exhausting because once a team controls the pace mentally, you start making decisions you normally wouldn't make. A pass comes a little too early. A shot goes up before you're really ready. Somebody tries to beat pressure by himself instead of trusting the offense. Kentucky wanted that. They wanted you uncomfortable. That team finished 34-2 and won the national championship. But what impressed me most wasn't the record. It was how many different people accepted important roles. That is not easy. When you have that much talent, everybody has been a star somewhere before. Everybody has been told how good they are. Everybody believes they can play more minutes, take more shots, have a bigger role. So now the coaching challenge becomes sacrifice. Can you convince talented young men that giving up a little bit of themselves can make the whole team better? Rick did that, and when I watched him, I saw a group that understood the value of depth. Not just having depth, but using it properly. There's a difference. A deep roster can create problems if players are worried about minutes. But when everyone buys into what the team needs, depth becomes pressure, it becomes energy, it becomes a weapon. Kentucky had that. You know, people sometimes think great college teams are built around one unforgettable player. Not always. Some of the hardest teams to deal with are the ones where you never really get a break. You solve one problem and another guy checks into the game. You survive one stretch and another wave comes at you. That 1996 Kentucky team reminded me that greatness can come from abundance, but only if everybody is willing to share it. And that may have been the most impressive thing about them. And yes, I have to talk about one of my own teams, the Duke team from 1992. Now, I'm always careful with this because when you coach a group yourself, your memories are different. You remember the practices, you remember the mistakes. You remember the days when nothing looked very special at all. So I'm not looking at that team the same way people do from the outside. But I knew how much pressure they carried. We had won the national championship the year before, and when that happens, everybody wants to talk about defending your title. I never loved that idea. I didn't want our guys protecting something that had already happened. I wanted them pursuing something new. That was difficult. Christian Laettner was older, more experienced, and everybody in the country knew who he was. Bobby Hurley had become one of the best guards in college basketball. Grant Hill could affect the game in so many ways. Thomas Hill gave us toughness. Cherokee Parks was young, but he gave us another important piece. There was talent, no question. But talent wasn't the reason I remember that team. I remember the trust. The Kentucky game in the regional final is the best example. That game went to overtime and Kentucky pushed us to the edge. They were tough, they were confident, they kept answering us. By the final seconds, there wasn't time for anything complicated. Grant had to make the long pass, Christian had to catch it, and then he had to make a play. Everybody remembers the shot, I understand that. It became one of those moments people still show every March. But as a coach, I remember everything that had to exist before that shot could happen. Grant had to trust Christian. Christian had to trust the pass. The other players had to understand their positions. And all of us had to stay calm enough to believe the play could still work. That kind of trust doesn't appear in 5 seconds. It gets built in practice, in losses, in arguments, in difficult road games, in all the little moments nobody sees. We beat Kentucky 104-103 and eventually won another national championship. But when I think about that team, I don't think first about cutting down the nets. I think about how difficult it is for a group that has already won to stay hungry. That team taught me something I carried for the rest of my coaching life. Success can bring people together, but it can also make people comfortable. The best teams understand that yesterday's success doesn't owe you anything today, and those guys understood that. You know, when you've been around college basketball as long as I have, the funny thing is that the games don't stay with you the way you think they will. The scores fade, the rankings fade, even some of the championships begin to feel like they belong to another lifetime. But the people don't. The teams you competed against, the coaches who challenged you, the players who forced you to become better, those things stay with you. I was fortunate. I got to coach some incredible teams. I got to stand across from Dean Smith, John Thompson, Jerry Tarkanian, Rick Pitino, and so many others who helped shape the game in their own way. And I learned from all of them. That's probably what I appreciate most now. College basketball was never just about winning a tournament. It was about belonging to something bigger than yourself. A school, a locker room, a coaching staff, a group of young men trying to trust each other when the pressure was at its highest. Banners will stay hanging in arenas. Records will eventually be broken, but the lessons you take from great teams, those can stay with you for the rest of your life. And I'm grateful I got to see so many of them up close